Right. Now, next up we have, to continue along with our programming, switching gears, I'd like to invite up to the podium our longtime board member and longtime contributor and friend, Eric Stallmer, who's the Executive Vice President at Voyager Space. And please also, if the panelists for the next panel can make their way up, we will go ahead and get started. And thank you all. Hey, Eric, that was you. Yeah.
I think Karen just flew in. All right. There we go. I come with a bias, and that is that I think I have the best panel of the day, coupled with the best panelist of the day. And if I'm mumbling, bumbling, and stumbling a little bit through this, this discussion, it's just I'm overwhelmed by the brain power that is on this panel. Not just that, not just the brain power, the analytical and intellectual might that is here, but also three great friends that I've been working with all throughout my career in the space industry. Three great people that you should really get to know after this panel. But I would also welcome you to get to know them during this panel. So that is my foot stomp to say, get some questions ready, because you're not going to find three better people that know these issues, know the policy of these issues, the origins of the issues. For God's sake, one of them wrote a textbook on policy. So, I mean, if you don't love the issue that much, I don't know what to say. But I want to talk a little bit about, before we delve right into the beauty of on-orbit activities and what we're looking at from the public and private perspective. I want to thank Diane for those great remarks, and also for your friendship and the open door policy that you have in the White House. You know, how often do you get to say that the White House has such an open door policy? So thank you for that, Diane. The goal of this organization of Future Space Leaders, and Clay really touched on it earlier, but I really want to kind of echo what he said. It's about mentorship, and I say mentorship right from the get-go, because as I looked around here, I saw 8 or 9 of my former interns that were in here that are all now, there's one, 2 left. They're all working in this industry and thriving in this industry in places like NASA headquarters, like Bryce, like all over Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. So the mentorship is a great thing, and networking. Because Clay started this organization, and I think I was one of the trusted band of brothers that he called on early on, maybe because of our upstate New York Schenectady roots. Anyone from Schenectady? Anyone know how to spell Schenectady? All right, that'll be on the quiz later. You're so close, Karen, yeah. He did it, and Patricia and I were talking about this, because Patricia and Clay worked together early on at the very beginning of their career, and there wasn't a lot of mentorship. There was really none at all. Clay was a little politically incorrect when he said just old white men. I think the correct term is stale, pale, and male. And that's what we were, that's all you had. And people didn't help that generation below them. And I think it was with Clay's vision and bringing together all these people that didn't have those great mentors to create programs of just general mentorship, which is the Brooke Owens, the Zeds Fellows, the Matthew Isakowitz, and all these other opportunities that people have, because we want to see all you folks have the same opportunities that we have in the best industry that there is. So your task for tonight is, I'm sure you have mentors. If you don't, grab one, reach out and find one. Talk to people. Talk to these folks like that, leadership like my panel here that I'll introduce in a second. And others in the room. If they look older, talk to them. We're all here for a reason. We won't. You'll know we don't have the SGAC. What's that? Well, I'm just excited. I'm excited to be here. And then Brad said I got all the time in the world. So, all right. And then the last thing I want to do, I want to thank Rebecca. Rebecca, you have done an outstanding job putting this together. I know it isn't always easy, and it's hurting cats, but you've done an outstanding job. And again, I'm selfishly saying this, putting me together with these 3 wonderful people, I'm thrilled. All right, Carolyn Bell. Senior Director, Advanced Space Systems at Astroscale. NSR, analyst for NSR, with KSAT, with the Space Foundation, has written some of the best reports that I have ever read. Fantastic panelist, big mind for space, visionary, and the work that Astroscale is doing. You're going to talk about that in a second. Patricia Cooper, Space Policy, Strategy and Regulation Consultant at Constellation Advisory Corporation, former VP at SpaceX, former President or Executive Director of the Satellite Industry Association, Times in Government, Pan Am Sat, everywhere else. Karen Chenoweth, the creative company CS Consulting. We'll find out what the CS means later. Yeah, exactly. Space law and policy consultant, adjunct professor at Georgetown University, author, textbook author, and maybe the best job you had was chairwoman of CSF, and where I got to work with Karen. So I'm going to get rid of the mic in a second. I want you ladies, if you could just start off talking a little bit about your experiences that you've had in the industry in kind of this regulation and what we're looking at. What are some of the 50-meter targets we're looking at, and then the 100-meter targets down the line? So, and then we'll start up with questions. I have a few just to prime the pump, but I really want to hear from the audience and their questions. That being said, Caroline, why don't you lead us off?
I don't know if I'm confident enough to lead us off after that introduction and broad questioning.
Heartfelt introduction.
Eager to be here and speaking with you all today. Definitely want to emphasize that if you don't have a mentor, get one, because all of us are here, would love to chat with you. Where are we going? What are the near term, you say, and then longer term of in the industry? I would say one of the big things that I think we need to be talking about, and those like goalposts that we're pushing towards, are what are the enablers of widespread growth in our industry, right? All of us here, whether we're from policy or business or engineers, we see problems and we want to solve them. We want to do these specific things where we can see progress. And sometimes it's valuable to take a step backwards and take a more strategic mind of where do we want to go long term? Where do we want to take the space industry long term? And what are the pieces we need to put in place to get there? And then we can get into the nitty gritty. And one of those big opportunities that I think is in front of us right now is this combination of being able to use space for the long term. So this sustainability in the space environment, that's one of the things that we need to be successful long term. That's one of the core issues that we're working on at Astroscale. Then, of course, once you figure out what you want to do, it's okay, how do I actually get there? Sustainability of space is a big goal. We've taken the path of saying, let's remove debris objects that are getting in the way and causing risk so that they don't blow up into smaller debris objects that cause more risk. And so how do we develop a capability to go up and approach, capture, remove those objects? How do we apply that technology in different ways to make sure that we're extending the value of everything we put in space? Because that also helps with sustainability if you're not launching things as often because you're able to use them for longer. And then ultimately, what does that get you in space? What that gets you is a capability to interact with spacecraft and do a variety of services for it. So you can do maneuvering, that's what we're doing with debris, that's what we're doing with life extension, but you can also do other things like repairing spacecraft, like augmenting them with a new payload. And all of that gets you to this next capability that I think we need when we look at that big picture, which is infrastructure in space, which is not really something that we've had to date. So I think that's one of the other goalposts that we're really going towards, is how do we have the infrastructure in space to build a much larger economy than what we have today. I would say almost today we don't really have an economy in space. We have, pieces that use space to generate value, but we don't have a vibrant economy within the space environment itself. And putting infrastructure pieces in place will help us get there. And that's definitely something that we see policy minds, business minds, engineering minds coming together on. So that was a bit wide-ranging, Eric.
That's all right.
Hopefully.
That's all right. We cast a wide net and we pull it in. Patricia, how about you?
I had some thoughts too. Let's see if this is on. There we go. So my first thought is, from my decrepitude apparently, is that you're in an amazing time to join the space industry. I don't think I've ever seen a more exciting, innovative, unclear time. And I think that's one of the things that is both exciting and creates a lot of opportunity to think hard on the policy side. By almost every measure, the space industry is really interesting and poised for growth, change, but really more importantly, impact. I want to throw out a couple I come from the satellite side. I did not have a space dream. I got my first job at the Commerce Department that was satellite related was because I was the new kid in the office of a host of telecom technologies. I got the portfolios that were the worst. I got microwave, fair. And I got satellites because undersea fiber optic cables were proliferating. And the sense was satellites were out. You wouldn't be having much of those. There wasn't a lot of optimism about satellites. And then within the next 2 years of the Iridium program, a constellation wave started and innovation and rethinking began. So there's a cyclical kind of pattern in the space world. And some of the hallmarks of being on an upturn are investment, innovation, new formats for space architectures, new problems that we're trying to either solve in space or solve on Earth through a space-based service. So you're coming at a good time. Launch is 36% cheaper than it was last decade. 161 launches last year at a record. Spacecraft manufacturing, 90% reduction in the manufacturing cost per gigabit per second for over the last decade. So the cost of actually the capacity has gone down 90%. There's more capacity on orbit to actually compute and transmit than ever before. There's about 3.5 terabits right now, and already committed to be launched is another almost 200 terabits. So it's an extraordinary time of optimism. It hasn't happened yet. A lot of these are projects that are in the making, and one of the things that will affect it profoundly, not just investment, as Clay was talking about, but it's the policy, the thoughtful understanding of policies that either enable, reshape, or redirect, or in some cases chill this excitement. So one of the other hallmarks of this being kind of a boom, a bonanza period, is the services that are actually useful. And I would challenge you, every time someone says, well, this is a service that's going to increase broadband connectivity. And that's true, that's interesting, but so what? What does that do? Take it another step further and try and it's a challenge that I think we have operating in this sort of lofty space environment, to draw it through to human impact and to say broadband connectivity matters to communities that are remote and can't get distance learning. They can't use telemedicine. They don't have access to online resources that they need for their business. So this is an important aspect. Or the Earth observation kind of remote sensing data. How is it actually being used for precision agriculture, for cultivation in fisheries? These are important impacts that we need to remember when we're talking about space, because otherwise people are like, what does it matter? If you're not talking about what it does for sort of not just the economy and not just the space industry itself, what it's doing for communities and for our lives, then we're missing an opportunity to explain why this is so cool and to watch why this pattern of cyclical growth is just starting to tick upwards. So my other point that I told Eric I was going to raise is that there are two phrases that drive me crazy. One is, it's the Wild West up there. Do you want that one? You can have that one. I'm just thinking about the 140-page FCC application and the 5 years of public consultation that we went through with Starlink. No, there's no absence of rules. The question is, are they the right rules? Do they apply to the technology that's flourishing? Does it address what we're finding out are scarce resources? We know some things are scarce resources, orbital slots and maybe spectrum, launch pads. There are things that are limited. We need to think about what the limits are, how technology addresses that, and how whether the rules are sensible in governing those scarce resources and designed to make this sustainability goal that I think Clay did a good job, and Diane too, of describing both sustainable ongoing coexistence and development in space, and I think what sometimes gets cast only as an environmental no like, no, we shouldn't be doing it, it's going to have an effect on the space environment. All right, but let's put in context how it's going to affect our environment and how we might see technology as a solution, collaboration as a solution. So, good time to be here. Nothing is more interesting than the stuff that space can do right now. So try and relate it to an actual human good. And now's the time for us to be thinking about all these novel approaches in a really thoughtful way. And it's hard work, but, it's a good living. Over to you.
Well, ta-da. Okay, so I couldn't agree more with Patricia, who has been one of my dear friends and mentors. I consider her part of my personal board of directors. And it is not surprising that we would be in agreement about the fact that space is not indeed the Wild West. You will hear me say that again tomorrow if you tune in to the House Science Committee hearing at 10 a.m. So I think, how did I end up here or there tomorrow talking about this topic? And I'll say that there are two things that I think have been key to why I'm here today. One is my crazy willingness to raise my hand, and the second one is my willingness to take risks. And I think that's probably true of all three people up here, and I'm guessing that that's something that some of you can relate to. And so I would encourage you that as you think about the topics that we talk about, as you think about your day, that you ingrain that into your approach to your professional and maybe even your personal life. And the other thing that I think is really important is that you don't let a failure of imagination be the cause of your failure or your company's failure. Because to the point that has been made already, when it comes to space activities, there are so many possibilities in terms of careers, there's so many possibilities in terms of outcomes. There's so many possibilities in terms of the answer of what is the space economy, right? What are the capabilities that we need to unlock space? And there are aspects of what we're dealing with today, the technologies, for example, that Astroscale is perfecting that are targeted at a failure of imagination from our approach to space decades ago. Right, the failure of imagination that you might put something up on orbit, put it in a parking orbit, and that it would just stay there inertly, happily cruising along, and that nothing would ever happen to create debris, for example. Or that you needed to build something for 25 years instead of investing in technology that might be able to service it. Or the failure of regulatory imagination, that we should design regulations that are flexible, and that when we design the regulations that are flexible, we should also make sure that we have the staffing and the ability to implement and oversee those regulations. And so I think that those are some key points that I found. Is I'm here, I wrote a textbook, and it was all because I just kept raising my hands. Dear Steve Mermina at NASA called and said, hey, you want to co-author this with me? And while everything in my body said no, I actually said yes. And the same thing with being, a professor at Georgetown, and taking the role at SpaceX, and then at Relativity, and then even starting my own business as I have today, advising a whole host of companies for whom maybe too many I have said yes. But nonetheless, I think that those are really important things that I have learned and that I see in the people around me who have succeeded in our industry. So that'll be my addition to this part of the panel. Thank you, Eric.
Okay.
Also, I'm not old.
All right.
Neither are you, Eric.
At least not in spirit.
All right. So one of the things you're kind of going with, Patricia, is how great launch is.
Yeah.
We got all these constellations. Back when ICOS and Iridium, and in the early 2000s when they talked, what was the other one? Teledesic. Talked about all these huge constellations. And I'm reminded of be careful what you wish for. Well, this is what we wished for. We needed low-cost launch. We need all this exploration. Well, we've got all the things we asked for. Now, as we say, are the rules keeping up? Are the regulations keeping up? Can you guys touch on that? Because I think you said there's plenty of rules on the books. Yeah. Are they the right rules? And maybe what are the right rules?
This is the other phrase that irritates me. Is like, it's crazy that they let all these systems go without the rules in place. And I just think, this is such an unexpected development that constellations have thousands of satellites being launched. Not only that, that there are hundreds of thousands of satellites that continue to be proposed. There was a system that was just proposed in France for 116,000 satellites last week. So this sustained interest in constellations is new. And the idea that somehow government agencies would have, 7 years ago when no one was thinking that constellations were interesting, when it was the microwave portfolio, that they'd say, what we should do is figure out what the rules are for this service area that no one's investing in or building, and then we'll have them ready in case they come. That's just not going to happen. It's not the way that government works. Government makes rules with the best information they can, with the hard-won consensus that the White House and this administration and other administrations have really sought to get the best technical information, the best business insights, and the best understanding of what they can do. And then everything changes, and it doesn't fit. But it shouldn't. No one, did any of you on your bingo card see 4,500 satellites? When I started at Starlink, I did not. I don't know that I would have guessed that that would be the outcome, even though that was what we filed for. It's a pretty crazy, it's kind of bonkers. The same is true of a lot of different novel activities in space. So the question is not, do the current regulations fit? Of course they don't. But is there a danger that we need to act precipitously? And what information do we need to make smart decisions? And that's interesting for you all to think about.
I would really emphasize that again, that it's really a case of partnership
Yeah.
between industry and government
Yeah.
to figure out what are the right regulations, even coming up with the right questions to ask of, do we need a regulation, first of all? And then if we do, what is the right one? What is the right scope of it? Who needs to be coming to the table to talk about really the breadth of issues that are at play? And as much as people might frame this as an industry versus government, and industry doesn't like regulations, we love regulations as long as they're smart regulations, because good regulations and a good legal structure that's in place is helpful for industry. It's helpful for us to plan out our business, to know that we're mitigating against the risks that might come up. It's something our investors ask us about all the time, right? Are you going to be compliant? Is there a path here? Examples such as, several years ago, the US and Luxembourg stepped forward in terms of ownership of resources that are extracted from the moon. That's really important for investors in lunar resource extraction companies. So things like that are really helpful for industry to really be collaborative with and lean forward to engage with our government counterparts.
And I'll add that I think this is a really important point about as you look at the future, ahead of you and you think about your careers, it's a reason to consider spending some time in government and in industry, because one of the things that I realized was I had worked first in a law firm, then in Congress, then at the White House, and I looked at what I knew and I looked at the people that were coming to me with challenges, and I can't tell you how many times I heard over the course of my time in government, industry wants certainty, industry wants certainty, and I was like, well, we all want certainty, right? I want to know how long I'm going to live for. No, that's really not what that is about, right? I want to know that I'm never going to be old. And what I realized was that I couldn't really understand how to be a good government employee. Like I was a good government employee, but what does it really mean to ingest that information if you haven't spent time actually living in industry, in the private sector? I couldn't understand what it meant to be a good professor until I started being a professor, right? So I think that that's a really important kind of thing to think about, is you certainly can have a very fruitful and lovely career in government, in industry. I will posit that your experience and your ability to work well in one or the other will benefit from time in one or in each of those areas. So that's just something that makes me think of as we're talking about to people who are thinking perhaps about their futures and their careers. And then I will add to this that I agree that rules are pretty much always responsive to technology and operations. And while we'll reiterate that failure of imagination should not be the source of your failure, it shouldn't be the case that you think that you can get it right by looking ahead and thinking that we can predict all of the outcomes, which is why a flexible approach is really important, both a flexible approach in terms of the regulations and in terms of the mind. So if any of you work in government in the future, I beg you to take a growth mindset with you to your jobs, because it is often the case that the difference between a adversarial regulatory conversation and a partnering regulatory conversation is personality, not the rules. And so much of what we do in our industry, despite the fact that there is, there's true black and white, right, wrong, ones and zeros in terms of bits that drive, our activities, and they're, for the engineering team and others. But even there, a lot of it comes down to personality. So as we do our jobs, and particularly I can speak for myself as I've done mine, so much of what I've been able to accomplish or the roadblocks I've come up against have been because people had a thought about the way things are or should be, and we were challenged with the ability to get through that wall.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that. That's a really good point. Karen's absolutely right. I'm sure all of us have had this experience of going into a room, and you have a benefit because it's a lot easier to start a positive, collaborative conversation about space than it is, say, textiles or footwear. Like, this is a cool start to a conversation, and that's a great benefit. But the second thing that I would, in addition to Karen's really good point about curiosity and sort of tone and collaboration, as Carolyn's mentioned, I think the other is it's useful to know history. And it's not that interesting sometimes to read why a law was written the way it was. But if you're trying to get the wording changed, boy, it's useful to know why it was written that way and whether that's relevant at all or if it's ridiculous. If it's overtaken by events, it's a whole lot easier to push for that. So this is an industry that has a lot of legacy assumptions from the way it was in yore. And some of those are still relevant and some of them aren't. And I would encourage you, if you're looking at a particular policy issue, to try and cast a little bit backwards and understand a bit more how it came to pass that this stupid rule exists, because it'll make it easier to point out.
In addition to history, though, sorry, Eric,
you're
I'm
gonna
just
go
going to
now?
jump on this because I do think it's important that we also keep an open mind to other areas of expertise that may have contributed, for
Yeah.
example, to why that law was written or what issue you're facing, right? If you enter into a room and you're negotiating, maybe it's new policy, maybe it's a business deal, trying to understand what is the engineering perspective of that? Did it come from a systems approach or something else? What is the business perspective? What is the policy perspective? What is the communications and public relations perspective? Because everything that we're doing needs to come as the whole package if it's going to be successful. And it's not always easy for us to peel back those layers to understand, oh, I disagree with you, but now I see why you want to do it, because for whatever piece of the puzzle you're working on, this really helps. And that can really get you to a better outcome. And it's just more interesting along the path. So I would say that perspective, and then also just knowing people outside of your area of expertise is fun. It definitely helps work be more enjoyable, but it also helps you be more effective in your job when you enter into these rooms where, not only are you coming into the benefit that, yes, we all love space, but also I met you at a conference 2 years ago and we had a great conversation about camping or something like that. And we work in an industry that's small enough where you will be running into the same people over and over, and investing the time to build real relationships, not transactional, but real relationships with those people will help you throughout your career.
Well, you're pulling on a string, and you guys have teed this up really well for me. As you said, the flexible approach, looking at it from a historical perspective, diversity of thought. Karen and I had the opportunity, I don't mean to pull back on scar tissue here, but working on regulatory reform on launch and reentry. And how this all got started. It was a White House directive from the previous administration, a space policy directive, to look at regulatory reform. And the one thing we asked for, be careful what you wish for, is that these rules really need to be streamlined. And Karen, you kind of headed up the effort to streamline the launch and reentry to get it to the part 450. I forget what the original part was. You want to talk about that experience that we had working with the FAA, literally change the regulatory language and the makeup of how we launch and how we re-enter? Because when it was written, it was a completely different world that we're engaging in.
Yes, this is the part where I'm called the dog that caught the car. So, yes, thanks, Eric. Yeah, so, a funny part about that story is that there was the first National Space Council meeting of the last administration, and Gwen Shotwell, president of SpaceX, was one of the people that testified, so to speak, and I had helped prepare her and some things to tee up for the National Space Council, and one of them was the desire for regulatory reform of the launch, and particularly the launch was our focus, and to some extent the reentry regulations. An example of why we were interested in that, right? So I was at SpaceX at the time, and SpaceX had accomplished reusable vehicles. We were working on flying the Falcon 9 back. Well, the original regulations, the 415, 417 part of the FAA's space launch regulations, didn't contemplate the idea that an orbital vehicle could be reusable. The only reusable vehicles that were contemplated were suborbital, so like what Virgin or Blue Origin's doing with their suborbital vehicles. It was assumed that you would have an expendable launch vehicle, and they were based on the Air Force's requirements for operating vehicles off the range, which is called 91710. Anyway, so Gwen gets up before the National Space Council and has these notes and says something about having a white paper. And I remember thinking, what white paper? And then she committed to giving the National Space Council a white paper that I started drafting in that moment immediately. And I remember thinking like, oh geez, that was a failure of imagination, that she would offer up to follow up with something and I would not have something ready. So we did, and it was, I think one of the most important pieces of that was the collaboration that occurred. I worked hand in hand with my colleagues from Virgin, from Blue, from Worldview at the time, and a couple of other companies to really develop consensus recommendations for reform. And we even sat in a room and redlined the regulations together. So this is another point that I'll make, is in addition to thinking with understanding the history, bringing a diversity of thought to the room, always try to be the smartest person in the room. Be prepared, right? Do your homework, do the preparation work. I'm complaining to everybody that, that there have not, to the extent that they were advocating that the current National Space Council take action on mission authority and novel activities, show up with recommendations that aren't just be nice to us. Show up with recommendations that say, here's how I think you can do it. Be clear and concise. And so that's what we did, and we rewrote the rules. The FAA essentially threw our notes away and very quickly devised Part 450. They moved the rulemaking in a matter of 2 years, which is monumentally
Speedy.
fast. Regulations usually take 3 is fast, usually at least 5 to move through the process. And we are living under Part 450 now. To give you kind of what may or may not register as an example of the pain of this, only 4 licenses have been issued under Part 450. 3 of those launched this year. And I know for a fact that at least 2, and I believe it's more, violated the 180-day statutory time for review, even though the FAA was able to do tolling, which is to say, okay, we're going to stop the clock while you go home and do your homework, and then when you bring me your homework, I'll start the clock again. So, yeah. So that's why I say the dog that caught the car, because I've had to now operate under those regulations, and they have need for, as we say in the legal profession, but apparently not in the engineering profession. If you tuned into yesterday's ComStack meeting, they have the need for perfection. So we need to be working to improve them, and I think the FAA, thankfully, speaking of partnerships and working collaboratively together, is interested in doing so, because it's a burden on them when they can't operate efficiently under their regulations. It's also an example of the need and the challenges that government faces in going toe-to-toe with industry. So, and this was spoken about on the ComStack meeting yesterday, was as they work to recruit, great candidates into the FAA to work on the other side from industry, to evaluate our applications, to implement the rules, to provide engineering analysis, they're having trouble recruiting and retaining those people because industry's demand for them is so strong. So, that is certainly something to be kind of cognizant of, is that need to keep a balance between the two and the need for really smart people to go to government.
I would just add one thing. So I saw in a different context some of the same hallmarks when I ran the Satellite Industry Association, a kind of collection of satellite companies that were complaining constantly about a section of the FCC's rules, Part 25, which is the most arcane, horrible, detailed, gnarly rules, but they affect you every day because they're sort of the nuts and bolts of your activities. And we finally started talking to the FCC staff about it, and they were burdened by this sort of inefficiency and lack of kind of currency in their rules as well, but they were underwater in terms of time and availability, but also, I think, a little nervous that if they proposed whole-scale rewrites, that industry would lose their minds. So we started a more than year-long process of experts in this Part 25 and went through and did a first round of things that were just kind of cleanups. And then the second were, I would say modest proposals for revision, and then there were some that were more contentious. And after developing them in a group of, 15 companies or so, and their noted experts, we started having sessions with the FCC to show them what we thought could be done. And some of that they took wholesale because they're like, yeah, I agree, that doesn't make any sense. Others, they thought it was interesting, the direction that we had, but had other requirements or objectives, to your point, Carol, that there's a need to kind of know what their obligations and what they're trying to accomplish are too. And some they couldn't take because they were too difficult, there were, other reasons. But the outcome of a fairly painful year, mostly because it was pretty boring, was a real improvement in this very important, dense set of rules that came from collaboration, kind of neutral collaboration of companies and a good faith collaboration with the staff.
Awesome. Hey, I want to keep my word and take questions from the audience.
Yeah.
What? Do I have a gift? Oh, yeah. So who's got some questions and some thoughts? Frank, right here. I'm not going to know everyone by name, but I know.
Yeah, so I'm Frank. I'm an analyst at Bryce Tech, also a former intern of Eric. So this question's for all three of you, but Carolyn, it's spawned by something that you said, which was that, yes, there are companies that have business in space, but we're not at like a big space economy or mature space economy necessarily. So what would that look like, a mature space economy look like for you? And what, not only technologies, but also what policies would enable that?
So when I think of the space economy that would be robust, I always use the word dynamic because the space economy, if we call it that, what we have today are satellites that operate on their own. Yes, maybe you have a constellation, so they're somewhat operating in concert, but they still are up there, have to rely on themselves, and if they fail, they're done. What I want us to see as we build into a real economy in space is the ability to interact between different objects in space. I want to see more value transferred and delivered directly in space. Right now, all of the value comes from building and launching satellites up, stays on the ground, or it's delivered to users on the Earth, which is wonderful. There are so many different applications of that, but for us to improve the amount of value that we're delivering to the Earth, we need to have a value chain within the space environment itself. And so to me, that's the backbone of that space economy. So it's making sure that we have services to satellites. We can, fix satellites in space. We can build them in space. We have robust commercial space stations where there's consistently different user bases that don't need to have an expertise in space. I think that's another really important thing, is making sure that using the space environment doesn't require you to be a space expert. And so there are the platforms and the infrastructure in place for you to do that. In terms of what we need from a policy perspective to get there, I do think we need some rules around ensuring that when an object is no longer used, it is responsibly taken care of within a reasonable length of time. And that's something that does need to be defined nation by nation. Hopefully we can come together globally on that. I think another piece is streamlining the regulatory process for satellites interacting with each other. Right now, if we have a US licensed vehicle that wants to interact with a French licensed vehicle, that's a much more complicated undertaking than if you have US with US. And so some way to ease that process and also make sure that it doesn't need a significant amount of time to happen, because we will have situations in space where we want to have sort of emergency servicing. So is there a pathway for companies to be able to provide those services? Sort of like, you don't need a special license to have a tow truck come get you if you're in Arkansas, if your car is registered in Colorado, right? They're just going to be there.
Yeah, and I would think another hallmark of a mature space industry is that we've given equal thought at all phases of space. I think we've, the early era of space didn't think very much about the end of life. You sort of, no one will notice. We'll just leave it over here. And I think we're really revisiting that now. We're definitely thinking what should happen. We're also, I think, much more attuned to the interplay between companies, between different kinds of technologies, between different mission sorts and different governments. I think that international shared environment is informing our policies a lot more. And when you see that happening a little more regularly, I think that'll be another mark. And the last one is they'll be ever changing, but clearer, more consistent rules about what we think are scarce, the limits, the scarcities that we have in space. And I don't think we quite know what those scarcities and limits are. So that's not quite, we're not quite there yet. And we'll have, some of those will be shared with other technologies like space, like spectrum, I mean.
Yeah, I think I'll add to this that I think that one of the things that we should be, we clearly need to deal with some of the challenges that we face today, right? So novel activities, upcoming activities that we definitely, they're in development, they're pending, they're kind of in almost a panic mode for needing to know who they're talking to, who's going to give them the authorization, and how they move forward. We also, I think, need to get to a place where we have the time and the brain space and put some effort to thinking about what that future state is when we have this more robust economy. So I think this is maybe a restatement of what has been said. Right now in our country, we have a division between private sector, we've got civil, we've got national security, and then we've got, and then the private sector has FCC, NOAA, remote sensing, and, is it, because it has been this way, is that the way it should always be? And I think that we need to take some time and really think about what the future of oversight of space activities looks in for us, and we should be thinking about that also in an international manner too. So what does it look like that we could do or could do in partnership with other countries that will create an opportunity for a truly robust space economy and space activities that is minimally burdensome but addresses the kind of concerns that you have around safety and around sustainability. And I'm not sure that what we have today is what we need in the future.
I wanted to just remind, I think it was your boss, Carissa Christensen, who wrote an op-ed that said every country should have a space agency. Not because they're necessarily going to fly something in space or create a launch vehicle, but because they're going to use services that are from space platforms. That is the start of a mature space economy.
And I think it's also interesting because I would like the UK and Luxembourg, I loved when they set up their
Yeah.
space agencies
Yeah.
because yes, my background is in science. I love science. I love that NASA does science, but both of those countries put them in their Ministry of Economy because they saw space as an economic activity, and the purpose of the agency was to support economic growth, which is a totally different approach that opens different doors.
Yeah.
Great. We have another question? Right here?
Hi, I'm Bertha. I'm a Factor Fellow and working at OrbitFab this summer. So definitely working on orbit activities in regards to refueling. I was wondering what your perspective is on that, especially in regards to debris removal, because that was what a lot of my work was in engineering.
I think what OrbitFab is doing is really exciting. We collaborate with them a lot. We're just down the street from them in Colorado, because when we look at scarce resources in space right now, fuel is one of those because we take up all of our fuel with us and then at some point we will use it up. And if we want to extend the usable lifespan of anything we put in space, one of the first challenges that we're going to face is fuel. I mean, then we'll get to electronics and other components that we need to look at, but I think it's a really exciting way to extend out what we can do. And it's one of those pieces that connects with other companies. One of the things I'm excited about where we're going in space is that it's going to be fewer large companies like we've had in the past and more small companies who have a really set expertise level that then are collaborating with others across the value chain. And I think that's both more fun to work in probably for all of you guys. You'll get a lot more latitude for what you can do, a lot more energy, but also lets you do what you're good at. And so working together is exciting. And most of us are collaborators already.
I would add a couple thoughts from the satellite sort of customer side. There's a lot of discussion in the satellite world about tech refresh. So for like a geostationary satellite that's up there for 25 years and providing communication services, I challenge you to think what 25 years ago communications was. That's what that satellite was designed for. So do you want to spend money to extend its life even longer? your grandfather's car that doesn't have, seat belts? Or do you want to invest in something new? And that's a really hard discussion for a lot of satellite companies. And then the format for a lot of the constellation companies is that their satellites last 5 to 10 years. So the question becomes, what is that extension? How does that play into these questions about utility and tech refresh when the abilities to keep up with the service you're providing is directly related to how long that asset remains in orbit?
I'll just say that I think this is a great conversation to also tee up for the next panel, which is going to talk, I think, about national security issues, because this is a topic that's really important to conversations about what our national security capabilities in space look like today versus what they should be in the future. So, Eric?
All right, I will tee it up.
They're standing there.
Are we ready? I didn't see Travis yet. All right. Thank you so much. Right on time.
Do you want your phone?
I'll take it. Brad kept texting me.